Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Imagine a world turned upside down. A kingdom where the whispers of the hungry turned into a roar that would topple a monarchy, rewrite the laws of man, and drench the streets of Paris in blood. This wasn't just a rebellion, it was a cataclysm that would forever change the course of history. We are journeying back to late 18th century France to witness the birth of liberté, égalité, fraternité, the explosive, chaotic, and transformative saga of the French Revolution. In the late 18th century, the Kingdom of France presented a dazzling facade to the world. At its heart was the Palace of Versailles, a universe of gilded mirrors, opulent ceremonies, and aristocratic intrigue, presided over by the well-meaning but indecisive King Louis XVI and his Austrian queen, Marie Antoinette. This glittering surface, however, concealed a society fractured by deep and ancient divisions, a structure teetering on the edge of collapse. This was the Ancien Régime, the old regime, a world where birthright determined destiny. French society was rigidly stratified into three orders, or estates. The first estate was the clergy, who owned roughly 10% of the land and paid virtually no taxes, yet held immense spiritual and political influence. The second estate was the nobility, a class of hereditary aristocrats and military leaders who, despite making up less than 2% of the population, controlled a vast portion of the nation's wealth and land. They too were exempt from the most burdensome taxes and enjoyed exclusive rights to the highest offices in the state, the church, and the army. And then there was everyone else, the third estate. This colossal group, comprising over 97% of France's 26 million people, was a diverse collection of peasants, urban laborers, artisans, merchants, doctors, and lawyers. From the poorest farmer to the wealthiest banker, they shared a common fate. They bore the entire financial weight of the kingdom. They paid the crushing taille, a tax on land, the hated gabelle, a tax on salt, and a web of feudal dues to their local lords. While the bourgeoisie, the educated middle class, grew in wealth and ambition, they were systematically excluded from power and prestige. As the century wore on, this injustice became unbearable. A series of poor harvests led to soaring bread prices, pushing the urban poor to the brink of starvation. The chasm between the extravagant life at court and the daily struggle for survival in the streets of Paris grew into an unbridgeable abyss. France was a powder keg of social resentment, economic hardship, and systemic inequality. The kingdom was not merely in crisis. It was on the brink of an eruption that would reshape the very fabric of Western civilization. While the foundations of the old regime were cracking under economic and social pressure, a revolution of the mind was already well underway, providing the intellectual dynamite that would ultimately bring the structure down. This was the Age of Enlightenment, a powerful intellectual movement that championed reason, science, and individualism over tradition and faith. Across Europe, and particularly in the salons and coffeehouses of Paris, philosophers known as the philosophes dared to question everything about the world they inhabited. Their ideas, printed in forbidden books and whispered in intellectual circles, spread like wildfire. England's John Locke had earlier argued that all men possessed natural rights to life, liberty, and property, and that government existed only by the consent of the governed. Baron de Montesquieu, in his seminal work, The Spirit of the Laws, advocated for the separation of powers within government, a radical check on the absolute power of the monarch. The brilliant and acerbic Voltaire used his sharp wit to relentlessly attack the injustices of the French monarchy and the hypocrisy of the Catholic Church, championing freedom of speech and religious tolerance. But perhaps most influential of all was Jean-Jacques Rousseau. His concept of the social contract posited that the king did not have a divine right to rule, but that true sovereignty resided with the people themselves. He argued that government should be an expression of the general will of the populace. These were not mere abstract theories. They were direct assaults on the twin pillars of the old regime, the absolute monarchy and the privileged hierarchy of the estates. The Enlightenment taught a generation of Frenchmen, particularly the educated and increasingly frustrated bourgeoisie of the Third Estate, a new vocabulary. Words like citizen, nation, social contract, and natural rights. It gave them the intellectual framework to articulate their grievances, not as mere complaints, but as violations of fundamental human principles. It armed them with the conviction that a better, more just, and more rational society was not only possible, but was their right to create. The abstract ideals of the Enlightenment found explosive, real-world expression in an unlikely place: the distant colonies of North America. The American Revolution, which began in 1775, was more than just a colonial rebellion. It was a practical application of the very principles that French philosophers had been championing for decades. It was a thunderclap that echoed across the Atlantic, shaking the foundations of Europe's old monarchies. Driven by a desire to weaken its arch-rival Great Britain, the French monarchy under Louis XVI made a fateful decision to officially support the American colonists. France poured an immense amount of money, troops, and naval power into the American cause. This intervention was decisive, tipping the scales in favor of the colonists and securing their independence. But in doing so, the French monarchy had unwittingly fostered a revolution that would ultimately inspire its own demise. French officers and soldiers, men like the idealistic young Marquis de Lafayette, served alongside George Washington's army. They witnessed firsthand a people fighting and dying for the principles of liberty, representative government, and freedom from a tyrannical king. They saw a nation being born not from divine right or ancient lineage, but from a declaration of independence that proclaimed that all men are created equal. When these soldiers returned to France, they were hailed as heroes. But they brought back more than just war stories. They brought back revolutionary ideas, validated by victory. They had seen that a republic, governed by its citizens without a king, was not just a philosopher's dream, but a viable reality. The American example provided a powerful and tangible model for French reformers. It proved that the old order could be overthrown. The paradox was staggering. An absolute monarch had bankrolled a republican revolution, arming his own subjects with the ideological justification to dismantle his throne. The success of the American Revolution transformed the political discourse in France, shifting the debate from one of reform to one of revolution. The seeds of discontent now had a living, breathing example of what could grow from them. If the Enlightenment provided the ideological fuel and the American Revolution the spark, the immediate cause of the French Revolution was a far more mundane but inescapable problem. The kingdom was bankrupt. For decades, the French crown had been spending far beyond its means, living on borrowed money and borrowed time. The profligate spending of the monarchy, epitomized by the endless extravagances of Versailles, was a significant drain. But the true culprits were a series of ruinous wars. The 7 Years' War, and most recently, the massive financial intervention in the American Revolutionary War, had pushed the royal treasury into a bottomless abyss of debt. By the 1780s, the situation was critical. More than half of the government's annual revenue was being spent just to pay the interest on its loans. The core of the problem lay in France's archaic and profoundly unjust tax system. The two wealthiest orders, the clergy and the nobility, who owned most of the nation's land, were largely exempt from taxation. The entire financial burden of the state fell upon the Third Estate, the very people least able to afford it. A succession of finance ministers recognized the impending disaster. Figures like Turgot, Jacques Necker, and Calonne all proposed the same sensible yet radical solution: reform the system and introduce a universal land tax that would apply to all three estates, including the privileged orders. Each time, their efforts were met with ferocious resistance. The nobility and clergy, guarding their ancient privileges, used their power in the high courts, the parliaments, to block any and all attempts at reform. By 1787, with the nation hurtling towards default, King Louis XVI was out of options. In a final desperate gamble to force through his financial reforms, he made a momentous decision. He announced he would convene the Estates General, an ancient representative assembly that had not met in 175 years. His intention was simply to get approval for new taxes. He could not have known that in summoning the representatives of the three estates, he was setting a stage. He was creating a forum where the long, simmering grievances of the Third Estate would finally be voiced, not as humble requests, but as non-negotiable demands that would ignite a revolution. Within the gilded walls of the Topkapi Palace, power was not merely held. It was a fluid, treacherous current. The Imperial Council, the Divan, was the heart of this power, an assembly of the empire's most formidable men. At its head sat the Grand Vizier, Pargala Ibrahim Pasha, a man who considered himself not just the Sultan's right hand, but his brother and protector of the established order. And that order was being threatened by the unprecedented rise of a former slave girl. Hurrem's influence over Suleiman was no longer a secret whispered in the harem. It was a political reality that echoed in the halls of the Divan. Ibrahim, seeing his own star wane as Hurrem's ascended, decided on a gambit. He would use the council to reassert tradition, and by extension his own authority. The topic was the future of the succession, a delicate subject that was Ibrahim's chance to champion Prince Mustafa, the eldest son and the people's favorite, born to Hurrem's rival, Mahidevran. By championing Mustafa, Ibrahim intended to remind Suleiman of his duty to the dynasty's traditions, subtly painting Hurrem's sons as secondary. He assembled the viziers, the military agas, and the chief jurists, laying out arguments rooted in centuries of Ottoman practice. He spoke of stability, of the strength of the firstborn, and of the dangers of allowing sentiment to cloud imperial judgment. It was a masterclass in political theater, designed to corner the Sultan and force him to publicly affirm Mustafa's primacy, thereby clipping Hurrem's wings. But Ibrahim miscalculated the depth of the bond between Suleiman and Hurrem. The Sultan listened patiently, his expression unreadable behind a veil of regal calm. When Ibrahim finished, there was no immediate affirmation. Instead, Suleiman spoke of the merits of all his sons, praising the intelligence of Hurrem's eldest, Mehmed. He gently deflected Ibrahim's pointed arguments, shifting the conversation to other matters of state. The gambit had failed. Ibrahim had shown his hand, attempting to use the state's highest assembly to outmaneuver the Sultan's favorite, and in doing so, he had only revealed the limits of his own influence. The notables left the council chamber that day with a new understanding. There was a second, invisible center of power in the empire, and it resided not in the Grand Vizier's office, but in the Sultan's heart. With Hurrem, the Ottoman court had become a nation divided against itself, a schism created by the force of Hurrem's ambition. The empire's ruling class was fractured into unofficial estates, each with its own agenda and loyalties, all revolving around the polarizing figure of the red-haired Haseki. The first and most powerful estate was the Old Guard, the champions of tradition. This faction was embodied by the Valid Sultan Hafsa, who struggled to maintain the harem's established hierarchy. It included senior statesmen like Pargala Ibrahim Pasha and the Sultan's own sister, Hatice Sultan, who saw Hurrem not as a beloved wife, but as a dangerous usurper, a witch who had enchanted their magnificent Suleiman. Their power base was Prince Mustafa, the charismatic and capable firstborn son, who represented a continuation of the past and a bulwark against the unsettling changes Hurrem represented. They controlled much of the state apparatus and held the loyalty of the more conservative elements of the military and bureaucracy. Opposing them was the Second Estate, the new power bloc coalescing around Hurrem herself. This was a faction built not on birthright, but on loyalty to its creator. It included officials she had carefully elevated, men whose fortunes were inextricably tied to her own, most notably the shrewd and calculating Rustem Pasha, who would become her son-in-law and Grand Vizier. Her estate extended into the harem, where she commanded a network of loyal servants and eunuchs, her eyes and ears in every corner of the palace. Through vast charitable endowments, or waqfs, she cultivated an image as a pious benefactor, winning support among the religious class and the common people of Istanbul. The third, and perhaps most volatile estate, was the Janissary Corps. These elite soldiers were a political force unto themselves. While traditionally loyal to the Sultan, their sympathies often lay with Prince Mustafa, whom they saw as a warrior prince in their own image. Hurrem knew their loyalty was conditional and could be bought. She and her faction worked tirelessly to curry favor with their commanders, understanding that in any future succession crisis, the side with the Janissary's swords would likely prevail. This deep division turned the Topkapi Palace into a silent battlefield. Every appointment, every royal decree, every whispered rumor was a move in a deadly game between these competing estates. The nation of the Ottoman elite was no longer united behind its sultan. It was split into factions for and against his wife. Hurrem Sultan had not just captured the sultan's heart, she had fractured his empire's ruling class in a way no one had ever imagined possible. In the grand tapestry of Ottoman tradition, the threads of a woman's life were woven with rigid rules. The most unbreakable of these concerned a prince's coming of age. When an imperial prince, or shahzad, was appointed to govern a province, his mother was required by law and custom to accompany him. This tradition served a dual purpose. It allowed the mother to guide her son's political education, but more importantly, it removed a potential rival to other concubines from the capital. For Hürrem, this moment of truth arrived when her eldest son, Shehzade Mehmed, was granted his own provincial governorship, his sanjak. The entire court, from the Valid Sultan down to the lowest servant, expected Hürrem to pack her belongings and depart Istanbul, her time at the center of power officially over. Her rivals, led by Ibrahim and Mahidevran, breathed a collective sigh of relief. The source of their troubles was about to be honorably exiled, her influence fading with every mile she traveled from the Sultan. But Hürrem refused. In a move of breathtaking audacity, she made a personal, silent vow of defiance. She would not go. This was her tennis court oath, not sworn in a public hall, but in the chambers of her heart, and in the private, tearful conversations with her husband. She argued that her other young sons, Selim, Bayezid, and Cihangir, still needed her in the capital. She professed that she could not bear to be separated from the light of her life, the Sultan himself. She leveraged every ounce of love and influence she had cultivated over the years, challenging a tradition that had stood for centuries. The pressure on Suleiman was immense. His mother, his sister, and his Grand Vizier all insisted that protocol be followed. To break it would be to admit that his personal feelings for one woman outweighed the established laws of the dynasty. It was a direct challenge to the very fabric of the imperial system. Yet Hürrem's defiance, born of love and a fierce will to survive, won. Suleiman relented. He created a new precedent just for her. Hürrem would remain in Istanbul at his side. The oath she made to herself had been fulfilled, and in doing so, she had shattered one of the most fundamental pillars of harem politics. She was no longer just a concubine or even a favored wife. She was an immovable political fixture in the capital, free to consolidate her power and pave the way for her sons' futures, forever changing the role of women in the Ottoman Empire. For 13 years, Pargalı Ibrahim Pasha had been the second most powerful man in the Ottoman Empire. He was the Grand Vizier, Commander-in-Chief, the Sultan's brother-in-law, and his closest friend. His authority was absolute, his wealth legendary, his palace a rival to the Sultan's own. He was the Bastille of the Old Guard, an impregnable fortress of tradition and power that stood directly in the path of Hurrem Sultan's ambitions for her sons. The storming of this fortress would not come from a mob with pitchforks, but from a silent, calculated political assassination fueled by years of accumulated fury. Hürrem and her faction, led by the calculating Rustam Pasha, had been patiently gathering evidence of Ibrahim's hubris. They chronicled his every misstep, his adoption of the title Serasker Sultan, which placed him on near equal footing with Suleiman, his diplomatic blunders with the Habsburgs, his immense, unaccounted-for wealth, and his open contempt for Hürrem. These whispers of treason were dripped like poison into the Sultan's ear, slowly eroding the deep bond of trust between the two men. The final act occurred on a cold night in March 1536. Ibrahim was invited to dine with the Sultan at Topkapi Palace, a common occurrence. He arrived, suspecting nothing, and shared a final meal with the man he called brother. He retired to a room adjoining the Sultan's, as he often did for security. But that night, the fury was unleashed. 4 silent executioners, the palace's deaf mutes, entered his chambers. Under the law, the blood of the dynasty and its highest officials could not be spilled. so they were strangled with a silk cord. The next morning, Istanbul awoke to the shocking news. The mighty Ibrahim Pasha was dead, his body delivered unceremoniously to his palace. His vast properties and fortune were immediately confiscated by the state. The storm had broken, and the Bastille had fallen. It was a brutal, shocking purge that sent a wave of terror through the Ottoman elite. It demonstrated, with chilling finality, the absolute power of the Sultan and the terrifying, unseen influence of the woman who had his ear. Hurrem had not just eliminated her greatest rival. She had decapitated the entire opposition faction. The path to the throne for her sons was now clear of its most formidable obstacle. The old world was gone, and the age of Hurrem had truly begun. While the tremors of the Bastille's fall shook Paris, a different kind of seismic event was beginning to convulse the French countryside. For centuries, the rural peasantry had endured the crushing weight of feudalism, a complex web of taxes, tithes, and obligations owed to the local lord, the church, and the king. Their lives were a cycle of toil and deference. But the news from the capital, carried by merchants and travelers, ignited a spark of hope that quickly spiraled into a blaze of panic and rebellion. This period, from late July to early August 1789, would become known as La Grande Peur, the Great Fear. It was a phenomenon fueled by rumor and desperation. Whispers spread like wildfire through villages and farms. The aristocrats, enraged by the events in Paris, were plotting a terrible revenge. They were hiring bands of brigands and foreign mercenaries to sweep through the countryside, burning crops and slaughtering livestock to starve the people into submission. This aristocratic conspiracy was a terrifying prospect for a population already on the edge due to poor harvests and bread shortages. Fear, however, did not lead to paralysis. It led to action. Peasants armed themselves with pitchforks, scythes, and hunting muskets, forming militias to defend their homes and fields. They patrolled the roads and kept watch through the night, waiting for the phantom brigands who never arrived. When no enemy appeared, the armed and mobilized peasantry, now realizing its own collective strength, turned its attention to the true source of its misery, the chateau of the nobility. The Great Fear transformed into a widespread agrarian insurrection. Crowds marched on the manors, not primarily to loot or kill, but to find and destroy the legal instruments of their oppression. They stormed the archives, demanding the terriers, the feudal charters that meticulously listed every last duty and payment they owed. With bonfires fueled by centuries of servitude, they erased their debts in smoke and ash. This was a direct assault on the very foundation of the Ancien Régime. The National Assembly in Paris could not ignore the inferno in the countryside. The reports of burning chateaux forced them to confront the issue of feudalism head-on, leading directly to the momentous decrees of August 4th, which would sweep away aristocratic privilege and forever alter the social fabric of France. In the wake of the August decrees that had dismantled the feudal system in a single night, the National Assembly faced a monumental task: to build a new France from the ashes of the old. Before a constitution could be written, its guiding principles had to be established. The deputies, steeped in the philosophy of the Enlightenment, sought to create a document that would serve as the sacred text for a new age of liberty and reason. The result, adopted on August 26, 1789, was the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. This was more than a law. It was a revolutionary manifesto. Its 17 articles were a direct repudiation of everything the Ancien Régime stood for. The opening line was a thunderclap. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This simple phrase obliterated the concept of a society structured by birthright, privilege, and divinely ordained hierarchy. The declaration proclaimed that sovereignty resided not in the king, but in the nation itself. It enshrined fundamental liberties that had been unthinkable just months before: freedom of speech, freedom of the press, and freedom of religion. It established new principles of justice, such as the presumption of innocence and the idea that laws should only prohibit actions harmful to society. It asserted that all citizens had the right to participate in the making of laws, either personally or through their representatives, and that taxation should be based on the ability to pay. Drawing inspiration from thinkers like John Locke and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, as well as the recent American Declaration of Independence, the French document aimed for universal significance. It spoke not just of the rights of Frenchmen, but of man in the abstract, intending its principles to be a beacon for all humanity. Yet, for all its soaring rhetoric, the Declaration had profound limitations. The man it spoke of was implicitly a property-owning male. It offered no rights to women, prompting the playwright Olympe de Gouges to pen her own Declaration of the Rights of Woman 2 years later. It did not address the institution of slavery in France's colonies. Despite these failings, its impact was undeniable. It was the death certificate of absolute monarchy and the birth certificate of a new political era, providing the ideological foundation upon which the entire revolution would be built and judged. By the autumn of 1789, the revolutionary fervor that had produced the Declaration of the Rights of Man had not filled the stomachs of the Parisian people. The city was once again in the grip of a severe bread shortage, and prices soared beyond the reach of ordinary families. Rumors festered in the markets and bakeries. The king and queen, living in the distant splendor of Versailles, were hoarding grain and plotting with aristocrats to reverse the revolution. The final spark came with news of a royal banquet where officers had supposedly trampled the red, white, and blue tricolor cockade, the symbol of the new France, and toasted the monarchy. For the women of Paris, who bore the daily burden of feeding their families, this was the ultimate insult. On the rainy morning of October 5th, their patience snapped. A young woman began beating a drum in the central market, and soon a crowd of thousands, primarily working-class women known as poissardes, gathered, armed with kitchen knives, rolling pins, and pikes. Their initial target was the Hôtel de Ville, the city hall, where they demanded bread and weapons. But their objective quickly grew more ambitious. Their cry became, "To Versailles!" They would take their demands directly to the king. This was not a mindless mob. It was a determined political force. Thousands of women, joined by men and members of the National Guard, began the grueling 12-mile march to Versailles in the pouring rain. They were driven by a potent combination of hunger and political outrage. They believed that if the king were among his people in Paris, he could not be misled by corrupt courtiers and would be forced to address the food crisis. Upon reaching Versailles, they swarmed the grounds and sent a delegation into the National Assembly itself, demanding action. Later, a smaller group was granted an audience with King Louis XVI, who, taken aback by their ferocity, promised to distribute grain from the royal stores. But this was not enough. The next morning, A faction of the crowd breached the palace gates, leading to a violent confrontation that left several royal guards dead. To quell the chaos, the king was forced to appear on a balcony. The crowd's demand was singular and unified. The royal family must return with them to Paris. Louis XVI had no choice but to concede. The march back was a surreal procession, a triumphant crowd escorting the royal family, now their virtual prisoners, to the Tuileries Palace. The Women's March on Versailles was a decisive turning point, demonstrating that popular protest could bend the will of the monarch and forever shifting the center of the revolution from the halls of Versailles to the streets of Paris. For nearly 2 years after being forced from Versailles, the royal family lived in a state of gilded captivity at the Tuileries Palace in Paris. King Louis XVI, though publicly accepting the reforms of the National Assembly, privately resented the erosion of his authority. The breaking point was the civil constitution of the clergy, a measure that subjected the Catholic Church to state control, which deeply offended the king's devout faith. Convinced that the revolution had become too radical and that his family was in danger, Louis made a fateful decision. He would flee. The plan was to escape Paris under the cover of darkness and travel east to the fortress town of Montmédy, near the border. There, he hoped to rally loyalist troops commanded by the Marquis de Bouillé, and with the potential support of foreign powers like Austria, return to Paris to crush the rebellion and restore his authority. The escape, planned for the night of June 20, 1791, was meticulously organized but flawed in its execution. The family traveled in disguise, the king as a valet, the queen as a governess, but they did so in a large, slow, and conspicuous custom-built coach that attracted attention. The journey was beset by a series of delays, causing them to fall hours behind schedule. This meant they missed their rendezvous points with military escorts who were supposed to protect them along the route. The chain of errors culminated in the small town of Saint-Menehould. There, the local postmaster, a staunch revolutionary named Jean-Baptiste Drouet, recognized the king. His suspicions were confirmed when he compared the face of the valet to the king's portrait on an assignat, the new paper currency. While the royal coach lumbered on, Drouet galloped ahead by a more direct route to the next town, Varennes-en-Argonne. He alerted the local patriots, who quickly blocked the bridge out of town with a cart of furniture. When the royal carriage arrived in the dead of night, it was stopped. The king's identity was confirmed. His desperate gamble had failed. The journey back to Paris was a funeral procession for the monarchy. The family was escorted by National Guardsmen, traveling for days through villages and towns filled with silent, accusing crowds. The public's perception of Louis as a well-meaning father of his people was irrevocably shattered. His flight was seen not as an escape, but as an act of treason. He had abandoned his nation and conspired with its enemies. The flight to Varennes destroyed the last vestiges of trust in the king, radicalized the public, and made the idea of a French republic not just possible, but for many, necessary. The Topkapi Palace, once a monolithic structure of absolute power, was fracturing from within. The singular authority of the Sultan was now being contested not by foreign armies, but by whispers in gilded cages and clandestine meetings in shadowed corridors. This was the dawn of factions, political clubs born of ambition and survival, each orbiting a different center of gravity. On one side stood the Old Guard, a powerful bloc loyal to tradition, and to the heir apparent, Shehzada Mustafa. This faction, an informal but potent Girondin movement, saw in Mustafa the embodiment of Ottoman martial virtue. They were championed by his mother, Hurrem Sultan, and supported by influential pashas and janissary commanders who admired the prince's military prowess and charismatic leadership. They viewed Hürrem as a dangerous aberration, a foreign-born slave whose influence over the Sultan was corrupting the very fabric of the empire. They met, they plotted, and they leveraged their established networks to preserve the traditional line of succession. Opposing them were the Jacobins of the Ottoman court, a new and radical faction coalescing around Hurrem Sultan. Their rise was not based on birthright or tradition, but on sheer political acumen, loyalty, and a shared vision for a new power structure. Hurrem was their undisputed leader, the architect of a complex web of patronage that extended from the highest offices of state to the lowest ranks of the palace staff. Her chief lieutenant was the shrewd and ambitious Rustem Pasha, a man of humble origins, whom she elevated first to her daughter, Mirima's husband, and then to the Grand Vizierate. This alliance was the engine of her faction. Together they placed loyalists in key positions, controlled the flow of information to the Sultan, and used the state's vast resources to reward friends and punish enemies. Their club was not one of open debate, but of calculated maneuvers, strategic marriages, and damning whispers. The struggle between these two factions was a silent, undeclared civil war, fought not on the battlefield, but in the heart of the divan and the secretive world of the imperial harem. Every appointment, every military campaign, and every royal decree became a move in their deadly game for the future of the Ottoman throne. While the internal revolution simmered within the palace walls, the empire itself was under siege from without. For Hurrem's rising faction, the long and draining wars against the Safavid Empire in the east were not just a geopolitical struggle, but a crucial opportunity. Each campaign that drew Sultan Suleiman away from Istanbul was a test of her authority and a chance to solidify her control. As the Sultan marched at the head of his armies, Hurrem was left as his most trusted regent, a position of unprecedented power for a woman in Ottoman history. Her correspondence with Suleiman during these periods reveals a masterful politician at work. She was not merely a wife sending loving letters. She was his eyes and ears in the capital, reporting on the state of the treasury, the mood of the populace, and the machinations of the divan. She advised him on appointments, warned him of potential dissent, and effectively governed the administrative heart of the vast empire. This external pressure created the perfect crucible for her political project. The war was a constant drain on resources and manpower, and Hurrem and Rustem Pasha expertly manipulated the logistics of the campaigns to their advantage. They controlled the supply lines and the state finances, allowing them to sideline political opponents by cutting off their funding or assigning them to undesirable posts on the treacherous frontier. More importantly, the war became the primary theater for the rivalry with Shehzade Mustafa. As a brilliant military commander, Mustafa's popularity with the Janissaries soared with every victory against the Persians. While this strengthened the empire's borders, it was perceived as a grave threat by Hurrem's faction. They began a subtle but relentless campaign of disinformation, portraying Mustafa's success not as loyalty, but as unchecked ambition. They whispered to Suleiman that the soldiers' devotion was to his son, not to him, and that Mustafa was forging his own power base among the troops, perhaps in preparation for a coup. The revolution Hurrem was engineering was truly under siege, not just from the Safavids, but from the rising star of the very prince she sought to displace. The year is 1553. The long, simmering Cold War between the factions is about to turn brutally hot. The final campaign against Persia would serve as the backdrop for the Ottoman equivalent of the storming of the Tuileries. Not the fall of a palace, but the fall of a prince, the tragic and violent end of Shehzadeh Mustafa. For years, Hurrem and her Grand Vizier, Rustem Pasha, had been carefully laying a trap. They had intercepted correspondence, forged letters, and cultivated a narrative of treason around the popular air. The seeds of doubt they had planted in Suleiman's mind were about to bear their bitter fruit. Rustem Pasha, in a calculated move, sent one of Mustafa's trusted commanders to the prince, urging him to join the army and warning him that his father, now old and frail, was considering replacing him. The commander then reported back to Suleiman that the Janissaries were restless and believed only Mustafa was fit to lead, confirming the Sultan's deepest fears. Suleiman, convinced of his son's imminent betrayal, summoned Mustafa to his imperial tent near Eregli in modern-day Turkey. The prince's advisors begged him not to go, sensing a trap. But Mustafa, confident in his innocence and his father's love, could not conceive of disobeying a direct order from the Sultan. He rode into the camp, hailed by the cheering soldiers, and disarmed himself before entering the tent of absolute power. What he found inside was not his father, but a chilling silence and a line of imperial executioners. The drapes were drawn. As Mustafa entered the inner chamber, the mutes, the Sultan's deaf executioners, who carried out sentences on royalty without spilling blood, surrounded him. A desperate struggle ensued. The powerful prince, a warrior in his prime, fought fiercely for his life. But he was overwhelmed. Behind a linen screen, Sultan Suleiman watched as his firstborn son, the hope of the Janissaries and the empire's brightest military star, was strangled with a silk bowstring. The monarchy of the future, the reign of Mustafa, had been violently overthrown. The path to the throne was now clear for one of Hurrem's sons. The revolution was complete. The execution of Shehzadeh Mustafa sent a seismic shockwave through the empire, unleashing a period of chaos and brutal consolidation akin to a massacre. The immediate aftermath was anarchy. The Janissaries, who revered Mustafa as their future sultan and beloved commander, were enraged. Upon seeing their prince's body displayed outside the tent, their grief turned to fury. They mutinied, directing their anger squarely at the perceived architects of the plot: Grand Vizier, Rustem Pasha, and Hurrem Sultan. They stormed Rustem's tent, accusing him of poisoning the Sultan's mind against his own son. The situation was so volatile that Suleiman, fearing a full-scale rebellion that could cost him his throne, was forced to make a strategic sacrifice. He stripped Rustem Pasha of his titles and dismissed him as Grand Vizier, sending him back to Istanbul in disgrace to appease the furious army. It was a temporary setback for Hurrem's faction, but a necessary one to quell the immediate danger. This single act of appeasement, however, did not end the bloodshed. The purge had only just begun. To secure the succession for her own sons, Hurrem knew that every trace of Mustafa's line had to be erased. A few days after Mustafa's death, an order was sent to the city of Bursa, where the prince's own young son, the 7-year-old Shehzada Mehmed, was living with his mother. Executioners arrived, and despite the desperate pleas of his mother, the innocent child was also strangled. This ruthless act eliminated any potential claimant who could one day rally support and seek revenge. The court was gripped by a palpable fear. No one felt safe. Any pasha, administrator, or commander who had ever shown loyalty to Mustafa was now suspect. A quiet but thorough purge of his supporters began, their careers ruined, their wealth confiscated, or their lives forfeit. This was Hurrem's September Massacre, a systematic and merciless cleansing of the old guard to cement her family's absolute and terrifying grip on the future of the Ottoman Empire. To comprehend the seismic shift that was about to shatter Europe, we must first recall the world Hurrem Sultan helped solidify. In the Ottoman court, the Sultan's word was absolute, a divine decree. When Hurrem maneuvered against her rivals, whether the powerful vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, or the beloved heir, Shehzada Mustafa, their fates were sealed not by a court of law, but by the silent, unassailable will of the monarch. The Sultan was the state, and his justice was swift, personal, and final. This was the pinnacle of absolute power, an authority Hurrem worked tirelessly to center around her husband, Suleiman, and her sons. 2.5 centuries later in France, this very concept of divine right monarchy would be put on public trial. The French Revolution, having dismantled the structures of the Ancien Régime, faced a monumental question: what to do with the king? Louis XVI, once the embodiment of the state, was stripped of his titles and became simply Citizen Louis Capet. The trial that began in December 1792 was an unprecedented spectacle. The National Convention, a body of revolutionaries, acted as both judge and jury. For weeks, they debated charges of tyranny and treason against the French people. The king, defending himself with a quiet dignity, seemed a relic of a bygone age. The verdict, when it came, was a foregone conclusion, but the vote on his sentence was agonizingly close. By a narrow majority, the convention voted for death. On January 21, 1793, Louis XVI was taken by carriage to the Place de la Révolution. He mounted the scaffold, attempted to give a speech to the massive silent crowd, but was drowned out by a drum roll ordered by his guards. Moments later, the blade of the guillotine fell. The execution of a king by his own people sent a shockwave across the world. It was the ultimate repudiation of the system Hurrem knew, a declaration that power no longer flowed from God to a monarch, but from the people upwards. The court of Suleiman the Magnificent, for all its splendor, was a place of lethal intrigue, a world Hurrem Sultan mastered for her own survival and ascent. To secure the future of her sons, she engaged in a ruthless political game where rivals were not merely outmaneuvered, but eliminated. The execution of Shehzada Mustafa, orchestrated through whispers and accusations of treason, was a calculated act of dynastic preservation. It was a purge born of personal ambition and the brutal logic of succession, carried out within the gilded confines of the palace. This was the nature of power in Hurrem's world, targeted, personal, and shrouded in secrecy. In revolutionary France, however, the concept of the purge would be grotesquely transformed. It would be scaled up, industrialized, and justified not by dynastic security, but by a terrifying new ideology. As the revolution faced threats from both foreign armies and internal dissent, the Committee of Public Safety, led by the incorruptible yet fanatical Maximilien Robespierre, seized control. Robespierre envisioned a republic of virtue, a state cleansed of all monarchist sentiment and corruption. To achieve this pure society, he argued, the nation required terror. What followed was a bloodbath. The law of suspects, passed in September 1793, cast a wide net, allowing for the arrest of anyone deemed an enemy of the revolution. The Revolutionary Tribunal became a conveyor belt to the guillotine. It was no longer about who you were, but what you represented. Aristocrats, priests, moderates, and eventually even fellow revolutionaries who were not deemed zealous enough, were sent to their deaths in public spectacles. Unlike the targeted removals of Hürrem's court, the Reign of Terror was an impersonal, ideological crusade. The guillotine became a grim symbol of revolutionary justice, its blade falling on thousands in Paris and the provinces. Hürrem eliminated specific threats to her power. Robespierre sought to amputate what he saw as a diseased limb from the body politic of France, creating a chilling new precedent for state-sanctioned violence. Hurrem Sultan's legacy was one of profound and lasting change, but the forces she unleashed were not without consequence. By shattering centuries of tradition, she centralized immense influence within the imperial harem, creating a new nexus of power. While this secured her own position and that of her children, it also set a precedent. The Sultanate of women that followed her era was a direct result, a period where the mothers and wives of sultans wielded extraordinary political power, but which also led to intense instability and factionalism. The system she helped create contained the seeds of its own future challenges. A similar, though far more rapid and violent dynamic, played out in France. The Reign of Terror, the machine built and guided by Maximilien Robespierre, had grown monstrously powerful. By the summer of 1794, it had devoured its creators. Having executed his rivals, Robespierre stood alone at the apex of power, but he was isolated and feared. The very members of the National Convention and the Committee of Public Safety, who had supported him, now saw the shadow of the guillotine looming over their own necks. The terror had become an indiscriminate force, and its architect was its final logical target. The breaking point came on the 9th of Thermidor, according to the new revolutionary calendar, July 27, 1794. Robespierre gave a speech in the convention, vaguely threatening yet another purge against unnamed conspirators. This time, the deputies shouted him down. Panic and defiance erupted. Cries of "Down with the tyrant!" filled the hall. Robespierre and his key allies were arrested. After a brief and chaotic attempt to rally support, they were cornered, recaptured, and condemned without trial. The next day, Robespierre, the man who had sent countless others to their fate, was himself taken to the Place de la Révolution. The fall of the blade on his neck signaled the end of the terror. The Thermidorian reaction had begun, a messy, uncertain retreat from the radical abyss, proving that a revolution, like the courtly power Hürrem wielded, often consumes those who seek to master it. The golden age of Suleiman, which Hurrem Sultan so profoundly shaped, established a powerful but rigid imperial system. After their passing, the Ottoman Empire, while still a formidable force, entered a long period of gradual stagnation. The structures Hürrem had navigated and manipulated for her family's benefit struggled to adapt to a changing world. Power remained concentrated at the top, passed down through a dynasty she had secured, but the dynamism that had once threatened Europe slowly waned. The empire's future would be one of managing a slow decline, not explosive expansion. In France, the aftermath of revolution created the opposite scenario. The execution of the king and the subsequent chaos of the Terror and the Thermidorian reaction had created a massive power vacuum. The Directory, the five-man committee that governed France after the Terror, was corrupt, inefficient, and deeply unpopular. The nation craved stability and order after years of bloodshed and uncertainty. It was into this void that a singular figure of immense ambition and military genius emerged: Napoleon Bonaparte. While Hurrem had worked from within the gilded cage of the harem to influence an established empire, Napoleon was a product of the revolution's meritocracy. A Corsican of minor nobility, he rose through the army ranks based on sheer talent. His brilliant campaigns in Italy and Egypt made him a national hero. He was seen as the man who could bring both glory and order to a fractured France. In November 1799, in the coup of 18 Brumaire, he seized power. He did not inherit his authority like an Ottoman Sultan. He took it with the bayonet and political cunning. He promised to be the savior of the revolution's principles, while simultaneously ending its chaos. Within 5 years, he would crown himself Emperor of the French, creating a new dynasty from the ashes of the old. While Hurrem's story is one of mastering an existing imperial system, Napoleon's is the story of forging a new one, the ultimate, unforeseen consequence of a people deciding to execute their king.